Okay. Excuse me. So here let's look at the last halacha of the siman. Kol ilan srak mutar lakot tzitzo. This was what Moshe was asking yesterday. Does this mitzvah of baltashchis only apply to fruit trees? And the answer is yes, it only applies to fruit trees. It does not apply to an oak or a maple tree or anything like that. Kol ilan srak mutar lakot tzitzo. You're allowed, actually, I shouldn't say maybe it does apply to maple because you can get syrup. I'm not sure about that. But you're allowed to uproot and chop down any non-fruit bearing tree. Afilu ein tzarech lo klal. Even though there's no need for you to chop it down, you're still allowed to cut it down, just like you're allowed to mow your lawn. In other words, the world was given to man to harness. And part of that harnessing is to recreate a landscape that is devoid of trees, if that's your preference. V'chein ilan maichol shehizkin ve'eno osa ela davar muat she'eno roi litroach bo. And another example would be if, let's say, you have a fruit tree that has become old and it's not producing a lot of fruit anymore, and it becomes too burdensome to maintain the tree. It's diminishing returns. You're not getting enough returns from the tree in order to justify its maintenance. So then, mutar lakot tzitzo, you're allowed to chop that down as well. V'chein kol kayotze bahem b'kilkulei sha'ar devarim. And that's not just true with trees. It's true with anything where the maintenance outweighs the benefits from the object. Can you think of other examples? What, you mean your wife? Okay. That's right. Well, it's like, I thought we were doing a Henny Youngman act, But anyway, so yeah, no, I'm saying there may be other things like a rickety chair, right? We don't believe in baltashchis, but at some point, when you fixed something enough times, you can certainly justify discarding it, especially in, we have such a disposable society today. Everything is disposable. Everything gets reinvented and recreated. So it's hard for us to even relate to a lot of these halachas of baltashchis because we are such a throwaway society. But recognize that there is this idea, or let's say a coat. You have you have this coat that you've been wearing for years, and like I have this coat over here. I've had to replace the zipper, and then or a piece of luggage, and it just becomes at some point you can no longer justify it. It's like you're holding it together by bubble gum and and rubber bands. So yeah. So it's an old car. Yeah, there you go. The Ilan Zayis, Shehu Osa Rova Hakav Zaysim, the Dekel Haosa Kav Tamarim Asur Lakatzitzam. But he says an olive tree, which at least produces a quarter of a kav of olives. I don't remember how much a kav is. That's not a large amount. Or a date palm that produces a full kav of dates, that's those trees you're not allowed to cut down. Because that's considered to be sufficient for you to justify their maintenance. The gam yesh sakana b'kitzitzas ilan maichel ela al derech shenizbar l'mayla. And furthermore, there's considered to be a sakana, a danger to a person. We don't know why yet. We have to discover why. When you cut down a fruit tree, unless it's done in the ways that we described above. So this is what you had asked at the end of our shir yesterday. What about non-fruit bearing trees? And this last sif says non-fruit bearing trees, you're always allowed to chop down. Okay, so let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Ilan srak mutar lakot tzitzo, you're allowed to chop down a non-fruit bearing tree. It's called Ilan srak, is the term of the Gemara, which basically says a tree of the forest. And that's really basically where we get lumber from. It's where we get paper from. So obviously you're allowed to chop it down. Yesh omrim da'af bi'ilan srak hakotzitzo eno roa simin bracha. He says there are those who say that even if you wantonly chop down a non-fruit bearing tree, you won't see any blessing from it, which is a bizarre statement. I guess you have to say it's talking about where it's in your backyard, not when you want to use it for industrial benefit. Ula midina nira de'ein lachush lazeh ba'ayin biurim. He says, but you don't really have to worry about this halacha lemaisa, and I refer you to the biurim, which we'll see momentarily. The gam yesh sakana. There may be even danger involved. Solomar isura yesh bo gam sakana. He says, and I guess this is based on some kind of mystical connection between the trees and the heavens, that whenever there's a prohibition to chop down a tree, chopping it down not only is a violation, but it also brings a person to a sort of like a spiritually dangerous situation. But when it is permitted, as we explained above, if let's say you need to build something in the place where the fruit tree is, you're allowed to uproot it, then there's no danger. Here he gives us a chiddush, and he's quoting, who's he quoting over here? He says, the Chaim Shal says that even when you're permitted to chop down a fruit tree, it's best to do it via a non-Jew, because that way you sort of remove yourself from the active activity. And some say that what's even more preferable is that you sell the tree to the Gentile beforehand, and then you hire him to uproot it. And what's even more preferable, he says, is that if it's at all possible, let's say you need to you're extending your house, and you need to uproot the avocado tree in your backyard. So what would be best is to uproot the tree with its roots and then to replant it if at all possible. Ulam min hanisayon near esh al pirov kasha ma'od ve'eno kedai mitam rov ha'avoda. But experience tells us that it's very hard to do this, and it's also diminishing returns. When you have an old tree, to uproot it and then replant it somewhere else, it's a huge amount of labor. It's usually not cost effective, because it'd be much easier just to buy a budding avocado plant from the store and let it grow for a few years, and it'll be much easier to do that. So therefore, even though that's what is suggested, it's really not practical, and therefore you're not obligated to engage in that activity. Okay, so that's the end of this siman Yud. And now let's go to the next. Let's go to the Biurim, where he just finishes this off. He quotes the Rambam in Perek Vav of Hilchos Melachim Halacha Tes. Kasav kol ilan srak moter lo kutzoso, vafilu eno tzarich lo ad kan lashona. He quotes the Rambam. The Rav Shulchan Aruch really was quoting the Rambam, who says that if it's a non-fruit-bearing tree, you're allowed to cut it down, even if you have no need to cut it down. The Harav Hosif al Zeh Tevas Klal, and the Rav Shulchan Aruch says even if there's absolutely no need for it at all. So the word Klal. Umashma de Bolomar Sha'afilu ein bo shum tzorech ba'olam b'ktsisa sonami shari. It's the implication being is that even if there's absolutely no reason in the world why you'd want to chop this tree down, just on a whim, it's totally permitted. B'lichor tzorech bir dim ein lo shum toivas hona klal madua shari. And he says, I don't really understand the argument. Like if you're not benefiting at all from chopping it down, why would we permit it? We said that baltashchis, the prohibition applies to any object of value, even if it's not a tree. So if I have a non-fruit bearing tree, So fine, it's not the item that the Torah addresses when it says don't destroy, but there's a prohibition of destroying anything wantonly for no productive purpose. I can't take a chair and just decide to smash it. I can't take bottles and just decide to smash them on a whim. So, like, why would it be permitted to just on a whim just destroy a tree, even though it's not bearing fruit? That's his question. B'tzarech lomer dekan mayri ba'ofen deleka shum chisaron behefsed al yedei hakitzitza v'havi ketolish ola mi'ilan. You have to say that there's really no really destructive act over here when you chop down the tree, because it would be no different from, let's say, pulling a leaf off of a tree. And Tosfos, he now quotes, says that even if you cut down a non-fruit bearing tree, you will not see blessing from it. But that's a singular opinion. And but the other poskim don't make mention of it. So obviously, if there's productive benefit, there's no question you're allowed to chop it down. If it's on a whim, the argument for saying that it's permissible is because it's no different from pulling out a blade of grass or pulling off a leaf off of the tree. You just want a nice landscape, and you're allowed to therefore mow the lawn, and you're allowed to trim the foliage, and to the point where you're even allowed to cut it down to the ground if you want a nicer landscape. I do remember learning in some Musar shir when I was a yeshiva bacher that a Baal Musar will not just arbitrarily pull a leaf off of a tree. You don't do that. Whereas this is Hashem's creation. If there's no productive benefit, just because you just you're walking along the street and you see a leaf, you just want to pull it off. He says that's considered to be insensitive in some way. So it's not a violation of Bal Tashchis to pull a leaf off of a tree, but a person should reach the level of sensitivity that any growing item, unless there's a utilitarian benefit, you shouldn't just wantonly destroy it. Absolutely. But we're talking about human refinement now. Yeah. All right. Let me wish you all a meaningful Tainus Esther, and we'll see you Mirz Hashem on Friday. Okay, we'll resume on Friday.